Good evening, folks. This is Dave March and from the Land of Confusion podcast, where we interview interesting people. And this is my co-host, Paul.
Hello, I'm Paul O'Brien, Houstonian appraiser and generally curious person. And our guest today is...
I'm Dan Flaherty, flattered to be referred to as interesting. Well, hopefully hope to live up to that, to that introduction there.
All right. Well, let's start off our show this evening. Dan, we are introducing you to the Ricochet community. We know you from Book Club with Richard Barris, People's Pundit, and the People's Pundit Book Club. You are always a pleasure to have as company in the group. You have an excellent voice for reading and really have some good questions that you ask in the club, and we're happy to debut you to other people. So can you tell us a little bit how you got involved with the book club, since that's the shared contact between all of us?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I came across Rich Barris literally right before the 2020 election. My wife had gotten into watching Steve Bannon. I was still kind of in the Fox News world at that time. Perfectly open to alternative media. It wasn't like an ideological thing or anything. It was just kind of what you did. And she kept tuning me into Bannon. And so finally, the last 10 days I started watching. And then Rich came on there, and the way he and Bannon were talking, I started to feel like maybe there's some hope here. Maybe maybe Trump isn't going to get killed, basically. Mm-hmm. And then I watched him on election night, and just the depth of his knowledge. They would ask him about you guys know how it is. They'd ask him about a certain county, and he would rattle off everything right down to the detail. And I'm like, my gosh, this is like asking me who won the 1960 World Series, or it's just everything is right at your fingertips. And so I kept up with him after the election. And of course, then, as you know, then eventually on his locals platform, then he started the book club, and that brings us here.
That's awesome. Yeah. So what do you do professionally, Dan?
I'm a writer. I work for a marketing company. I do search engine optimization writing. The company I work for basically works with everyone from law firms to home service companies, and they're based in California, so I do everything remote, and they will basically hand me a project for a website and say, okay, write all the content that's going to go up on this new launch. And that's what I do. And the result of it is you get to learn a lot of stuff. I was doing mostly legal when I first started, and you had to learn all these different practice areas with different state laws in every part of the country, and then shifted more over to home services and started learning that. So it definitely you learn a lot. I think that's the best way I would say. Yeah. You're always having to push and push the envelope.
That career is very sought after and very competitive. And you have to be on top of your A game the whole time, because you have a lot of young people who are always trying to move up and take those kinds of positions. So it's really impressive that you're able to compete with really such a competitive crowd going after that.
Yeah, thank you.
What do you feel has been your angle in that sort of work, in your contribution to that industry?
Geez, that's a great question. I think for the most part, as a writer, I guess I'll just say, I tend to be very prolific. My brain can function at kind of 1 million miles a minute. I can process things really quickly and absorb information fast. And as a result, say companies have liked me because they can give me projects. Again, I mentioned, this variation from legal to home services. You can throw a little healthcare in there sometimes, that they can feel confident that I can give him anything and he can do it, and it'll come back good. I just think that, again, a brain that runs nonstop can be disturbing to your peace of mind sometimes. But
yeah,
but
I know what that's like.
Yeah, but sometimes you find the right work, and it's a real strength too. So
yeah. I'm going to ask you more of the diva type questions, where did you grow? Where were you born? Where did you grow up? What was it like?
Yeah, grew up in southeastern Wisconsin, just west of Milwaukee. Pretty much your classic Republican suburb is the way I would call it. The area like votes, it's Waukesha County, probably votes 70% Republican. It was even higher at the time that I was growing up. Went to Catholic schools through 8th grade, then on to the public high school. And then went to college mostly at Indiana University. And then ended up coming back home to Milwaukee to graduate, and graduated political science. So there's always been a political interest, from all the way back to when I was in high school.
And my father went to Indiana University for his doctorate.
Did he really?
Yeah. So
Awesome.
it was back. It was. We have something called the Grey Cup, which is like the Canadian Super Bowl. He brings in all his friends to show them, because it's the first time it's going to be televised in United States of America, and it's a legendary game called the Fog Bowl, which went on for like 5 hours, and no one could see any of the players on the TV screen.
Oh my God, that's great.
Yeah.
So, a question I had for you, Dan, is having been predominantly raised in the Midwest, when you were consuming politics pre-2020, before, you had Richard and other alternative sources of outlets, did you just watch as a outlooker looking in, thinking there's so much going on, but somebody's not saying somebody is not saying what I feel or what I'm observing? Did you ever have those feelings whenever you were observing the current state of politics, that was sort of a void that Rich filled?
Yes. That's sort of, I have always felt what I would call like a real angst regarding the state of politics, because my natural political inclinations for someone of my generation was probably more of I would use the phrase like a pre-1968 Democrat, kind of like that working class that, we talk a lot about in the book club that Trump is tapping into these days. That, I wrote a novel that was set in Irish Boston in the, late 1940s, because like that was, my grandparents were immigrants from Ireland, and that was what I believed, that, where it was capitalist. It was a free market. Believed in those core values of hard work, but also that there were some, some things the government had to do, like, where you're not like a pure free marketer or anything. And as I went into college, the issue that really tapped into what I would call this angst between kind of this, this connection to that old school Democrat, and yet also growing up in the Midwest. Something Carrie Lake said that once resonated with me is where she said she grew up in the Midwest as a Reagan girl. And like, I was a Reagan guy, I'm still a Reagan dork. I've got Ronald Reagan socks that I wear to church on Sunday sometimes. So, like, I've still got that, that in me too, but the gap wasn't really between Reagan and the old school Democrats, because he was one himself, but in the way conservatism developed, I could just feel this angst of feeling like, okay, there are people that are not talking to the economic concerns of the working and middle class as well. And I know the Democrats are using the rhetoric, but their solutions just aren't right. And on the social and cultural issues, it's just complete non-starter. And the Republicans, they would say some good things, but but there was just a connection that wasn't there. And now in college, Pat Buchanan really made that connection with me. And but again, that was someone, Scotch-Irish Catholic. And, and now, like, and over time, like, he was probably a little harder core on legal immigration than I would have been. Emphasis on the word legal. He was completely correct on illegal immigration, and completely prophetic in the way things have, panned out. But he's the one that really connected with me on trade. And then he also started challenging the foreign interventionism as soon as the Soviet Union fell, where he began using the phrase America first again. And I think I was probably really fortunate that happened while I was in college, and I was still being formed, that it was like my own view on trade helped me make the connection with him. And then, so as a result, I was listening to him when he was talking about, the America First agenda, because I only knew Cold War politics at that time, and the Soviet Union as the evil empire. and now the Soviet Union's gone. And I was just, listening to I don't know if either of you guys follow Robert Barnes on his locals platform, but he was talking about Buchanan as like an old school populist, and he said like the day the Soviet Union fell, he reverted to his anti-intervention roots.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, that's right, and that's and it's interesting. It's funny because, like, for me, the defining political thing for me throughout my life has been Roe versus Wade and wanting to see that overturned. And within a week of its overturning, I remember just sitting in the kitchen and thinking, I put up a lot of crap from the Republican Party with their foreign wars, just try to get a few judges here and there that'll do this. And so, like, in that respect, like, I followed a similar path. Like, as soon as like this, this issue gets resolved, it's like, okay, I'm going back to these anti-foreign intervention principles. And that's, right now that, well, I still think, abortion is just this major, blot on America. It's handled at the state level now. Like, what I'm looking for in a president is, someone who will keep us out of these foreign wars, that are going on. And
the people that we've been mentioning this whole time, there's sort of a weird pattern is that I don't know if you've picked up on it. I always find it odd that the people who seem to speak to the spirit of that Midwest old Democrat voter are always people that are not from the Midwest. Why do you think that is? Yeah. Why do you think it is that people outside the Midwest have a better way of capturing the rhetoric in a way that's sincere that locals can't seem to do? Why is it that people like Pete Buttigieg can't resonate with people from, we know the reason why, but it seems the Midwest cannot home grow its own self-reflective politicians. The best winners that go into the Midwest have a tendency to come from way outside the Midwest, from places that are totally different. Pat Buchanan, DC, Reagan from California, places that are polar opposite. Why do you, just thinking about it, why do you think that is that the Midwest can't, capture the feelings and emotions of its own citizenry?
That's a great question. So I'm just going to be giving you off the top of my head here, because I never thought I'm going to be thinking about this more. But my gut reaction is that in the Midwest, there is still, like, among the working classes, that old school socialist William Jennings Bryan mindset that does exist, like in rural Wisconsin, certainly in Minnesota, parts of Iowa. So as a result, that really can't connect with the like, say, the connection that I would make would be to the old school urban Irish Catholic, which, if we really want to trace this back to like the elections of 1896 and 1900, whereas like William McKinley was appealing to the urban worker and William Jennings Bryan was appealing to the farmer, and there was a divide there. And so I think, I still think that, that tradition still lingers. And like, and there are people that come out of the Midwest that will say things like on trade that, like, I agree with, some of them like tilt, but they just have an overall economic agenda that's, very much Occupy Wall Street, where it's like, okay, I think you guys have diagnosed the problem right, but you're suggesting a solution that's just, far worse than any cure we're going to come up with.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is ultimately the reason. Whereas, like, say now to take Buchanan, like, he growing up near Washington, D.C., he was still connected to working class, Catholics. Even as his family started to become more financially comfortable, there were still a lot of connections to the working class. And so I think that's probably why they can make that connection. But that is a divide that exists among working class politics generally. And
yeah, I guess that's true. The Midwest is still very much like in some parts of Canada, our Midwest, very much the agrarian rural divide. It's still much more leaning on the agrarian side as opposed to the agrarian/rural versus the urban side.
That's right. And, and I'm sure you guys have heard, Rich or Robert Barnes talk about this, where you go up into northern Wisconsin and it's lumberjack country. And just because it's rural, it actually votes consistently Democratic, those 3 counties way up in the Northwest. Yeah. And that's, I think, a part of that tradition.
We have a little bit of that where it's like, why are these governments that are voting heavily conservative in a federal election voting NDP or left-wing governments consistently at the provincial level? It's very disconcerting here.
Yeah.
How would you say growing up watching the decades go by, that identity do you feel the identity has shifted or has remained consistent as you've gone through the years amongst your peers that you've like grown up with and observe, even the new ones that you make? Do you feel that identity has remained constant, or do you think it's shifted or evolved in its expression politically?
So like, to make sure I'm understanding your question, like, do I see like a realignment taking place among,
So as the generations stack up, are are do you feel whenever you talk to your friends they're looking for similar, like, are your friends looking for the same thing they were looking for 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Do you find that the wants are consistent, or do you feel like when things like Roe v. Wade flip, okay, it is, do you see it as more of a change, or this problem's now satisfied, now I'm reverting? Let's put it like that.
Okay, yeah, that's at the risk of trying to speak for other people and everything.
Well, your personal experience.
Yeah, I don't get that sense. Let's put it that way. I think I'm one of the few people that, at least that public, and the people that I might most directly talk to about this stuff, because that I can explain what I'm thinking about Roe v. Wade in a different world, and that you get a chance to unpack it. But just like absent that, most of the, I've always been kind of a little bit of an odd duck in my social circle anyway, with regard to, political views and everything. Generally everybody's always kind of on the Republican side of the aisle, but I was, certainly much harder core on the right to life. And the whole trade America first thing, I think kind of probably sets me apart a little bit too. Whereas I think most, like, the community I grew up in, I call it like the classic Republican suburb, in that they're kind of like, if you talk about taxes and spending and these traditional conservative issues, like, it resonates, it connects. It's might not be what connects on a national scale, but in that world, I think that's kind of what hits home with people, of just giving off a sense of that you're a competent manager of the economy, and like, say, and in that world, like, Trump is either hated or very reluctantly accepted. I would probably lean toward reluctantly accepted in a lot of ways, because, even though he actually is extremely competent, you really can't fault someone for just looking at the surface and thinking like, hey, what's going on with this guy here?
Right.
Hopefully the record of what happened as soon as he left will kind of make more of an impression, leading up to this.
He's definitely not Midwestern nice.
Exactly. No, that's right. Yeah. That's that is completely correct. And and again, in the world that I come from is, a little bit older now, like, Waukesha County's changing. There's more Hispanics coming in. So I don't have the same natural connection there. Whereas, the people I know are my age or older. So again, it's a generational thing. And some of it, I think, is just coming to grips with, like, not just Roe v. Wade, but just how much America has changed, or at the very least that we're seeing the reality of what was. I mean, it's whether it's our perceptions changing or it actually changing. But and I think everybody to a certain degree is trying to kind of come to grips with what exactly is going on here right now, ever since 2020. I personally have not seen it manifest itself in anyone having a real change of mind and how they approach it, but there's definitely a general awareness that things are different.
Yeah, that's something, because whenever I observe the Midwest, the Midwest is interesting in how, what I would say, un-American it is sometimes, because I feel a lot like Americanism is that excellence, strive to be the best, and go, all in on something. Whereas the Midwest, I feel, has this priority of harmony. We need to keep the ship steady, slow rise. Like, we don't need to do anything crazy, nothing flashy, just keep it slow and smooth. We don't, and anybody who does or perceives to rock the boat is often, I feel, rejected very hard. We don't need anybody, rocking the boat out here. We need, stability. And when you put that perception of, and I think that goes to the love-hate relationship of Trump, because if you're looking at him from a foreign policy standpoint, the man is harmony. But if you look at him from a domestic, domestic side, he and everybody's always pissed off all the time. The man is a lightning rod for aggression among the individuals. So it really depends on what side. I feel with that goes to that love-hate relationship, specifically with the Midwest, is the love of the harmonizers. And I think that's where maybe the idea of Joe Biden comes in, where it's just like, oh, the return to normalcy candidate. I want harmony. I want harmony in the domestic side, because I don't my political ideology really doesn't go past the coast. I'm really only concerned with the domestic, with what's going on domestically. And I think that's sort of that relationship that goes on, personally, in my observation with the Midwest. My question is, with Biden showing that he's not only not the return to normalcy candidate, but he is the gasoline on the fire to explode. I sometimes look at Richard's polls, and I think to myself, what we're seeing is the realization that, oh, Joe Biden is not the harmony candidate. In fact, as bad as Trump was, or as even if you were not a Trump fan, as bad as Trump was, there was never these real consequences that affected your life the way they do under Joe Biden. And and to put the question out, I was wondering if people in your observation have sort of had this, or if there is a rejection to Joe Biden where there was a embrace of him, what does that typically sound like when you see people sort of turning the leaf? It's not like they like Trump now, but it's just the rejection of people like Joe, or maybe even other presidential candidates in the current Republican primary.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had more personal experience of somebody that I knew, like, coming around on Trump. I see Rich's polls, like, and they're backed up in election. And I think, like, whether it's Trump, whether it's the vaccine, I thought, is it just me, or is nobody in my world ever everyone seems to kind of dig in on whatever their original stance was. I will say this: I did talk to a friend probably about maybe a year or so, maybe less, and he was one, from my old hometown, had always voted Republican, and then voted for Biden didn't vote Trump in 2016, but voted third party, and then actually voted for Biden in 2020, just because he was a classic case, and Rich has talked about this, of traditional Republican constituencies mad about COVID-19 handling, by Trump. And one time when I was back home recently, like, he came over to the house and we were just talking, and I hadn't brought up politics, but he kind of admitted, he said, like, I think I kind of screwed up, and he went on to talk about, he said, like, I was just so mad at Trump, like, and the way, and he said, and Andrew Cuomo, he said, like, look, I know he's a crook now, but at the time he was at least coming across like somebody who cared, whereas Trump was coming across like somebody who didn't care at all. And I mean, I think the exact opposite is true, but I mean, I remember when Trump was doing those press conferences and he was battling with the media every day during COVID. And me personally, like, I to be blunt, I loved it, because I was not looking to those press conferences for any sort of serious commentary or anything like that. I was like, nothing's. I kind of looked at it as like the halftime interview with the football coach. It's like nothing serious getting said here. So,
or even better WWE interviews.
Yeah, that's right. But credit to my wife, she was attuned to it, and she would say, like, I agree with what you're saying, but she's like, he has to be careful how this is going to come off, because, like, people are sick and they're scared, and they're, people are having family members die, and, like, him fighting with a reporter, however he might intend it, isn't going to go off well. And kudos to her, she read the situation right there, without even looking at a Barris poll to tell her. So
right.
But regarding the whole concept of harmony, though, I remember I had a conversation with a friend, and this was a while ago. This was before Trump, but we were sitting out at a baseball game together, and we were just talking about Obama, and he made a comment about how he thought, like, Obama was just kind of a middle of the road guy, maybe middle leaning left, but that's about it. And this friend is someone who votes Republican, and I just said, Obama is hardcore left. And he was just like, yeah, okay. And I kind of sensed the oh, it's just Dan talking, kind of coming through. But I pushed back and I said, like, no, stop and think about this. I said, like, Obama is very moderate in his temperament, in the way he comes across and the way he communicates. But on actual policy, if you look at it, like, it's pretty far to the left. And he kind of paused. He said, like, it was kind of like I had given him something to think about. And whereas Trump is the reverse, like Trump is one of the most middle of the road presidents that we have had. I mean, like any conservative will tell you, he's not a classic conservative. I don't think he even claims to be or anything. I mean, he's more of a populist, than anything. And even that, he's not a pure populist by any stretch. I mean, he's more of a pragmatist, but he manages to come off very ideological.
Yeah, he likes I think he'd refer to himself as being popular.
That's right.
That is a good way to describe it.
Yep.
I mean, I think that's consistent with him. He does what he feels will make him more popular, which I'm not going to lie, that's not a bad way to govern, because I mean, you have to listen. I mean, for that to work, you kind of have to listen to your constituents, and if you're successful, then all right. Well, I mean, that potentially works to our benefit. I mean,
he's very connected to his base, as evidenced by the fact he stopped bragging about the vaccine, like at a certain point. Like, I'm skeptical if he's actually changed his mind or anything, but he certainly became smart enough not to keep talking about it. But I mean, you also do certainly see some clear principles that do come through pretty consistently, like, in his governing. That one of the things I will always give him credit for is the way he fought for Brett Kavanaugh, and the way he really pushed to nominate Amy Coney Barrett before the election in 2020. Because I've always thought the easy thing for him to do would have been to say, like, look, we had a Supreme Court opening in the 2016 election after Scalia died, and we let the people decide. We're going to let the people decide now. And he would have ensured a motivated base to come out and vote in 2020. Now he got it anyway. So I mean, but he was willing to basically just do the right thing of saying, you know what? No, this seat is open. We're grabbing it right now.
Right. And it was an aggressive play, and it was exactly what we wanted him to. We wanted an aggressive president, not a tactical one. The one that tries to be tactically advantageous to himself, which in a weird way he did both. And it was absolutely admirable. A question I had for you, Dan, was you said you've always been sort of an odd duck in amongst your friend group. What is a view or a voice that you express that is typically appreciated in your friend group? What's sort of a take that is typically appreciated that people like to ask you for in your friend group that you feel is sort of different?
Now, in general, we should say, like, I recently relocated to Massachusetts, so I've generally just made some new connections entirely now. Amongst the new connections, I think just in general, like, and especially since I started my Substack and everything, people will just generally ask what's going on in the world. Our social circle is a lot of Catholic homeschooling parents. They're completely busy, overwhelmed, and really don't want to go crazy by what's in the world. And some of them have told me, like, they basically have said, like, you're our conduit to the world for what's going on. So it's not necessarily for a take. I mean, they have their take, they have their principles and their convictions, and sometimes it's just
you're their alternative media.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for a small group of people, the people I care about, like, I've been able to do that. So yeah, that's but yeah, I would not say it's not a specific take or anything. Like, the people I know, like, have pretty firm, convictions. So
yeah. What is it? We're getting back to Trump briefly. I always thought of Trump when Abraham Lincoln was asked to fire Grant on several occasions. And he would always say, "I can't fire this man. My man, he fights."
Yes, I've thought about that with him too. Like, I need this man. He fights. That's exactly it. And and I had so many doubts about Trump. I mean, well, I mentioned my original starting point with Pat Buchanan back in the early '90s. I mean, you guys may recall, like, when Buchanan broke third party in 2000 and ran in the Reform Party ticket. Like, Trump was in those circles at the time, and there was even an element of people pushing for him to be the nominee, and he was much more socially liberal at the time. So, like, the gap between him and I was, not bridgeable at that time. And I know sometimes I'll joke with people. I'll say, like, I know you find this hard to believe, but Trump said some things about Buchanan that weren't very nice at the time either. And when they were potential rivals, being an Irish person, like, I have a long memory. I carried that with me, into 2016, and I was definitely one of those who was really on the fence as to whether I'd vote for Trump or whether I would go third party. I mean, like, I can come off now as kind of like a hardcore Trumper, and I am, because I've been completely sold. I think I was wrong about him, But I mean, there's nothing that the never Trumpers say that I didn't say at one point. And it's almost made me even less tolerant of them, because I'm thinking, like, guys, I understand I had all those same opinions, but don't you have to change your mind when like events clearly show that like he's not who you thought he was? He's better, And I kind of think of if either of you guys have seen the movie The Godfather, where Michael Corleone is always on the fence of whether he's in the family or not, and finally, after the Don is assassinated or he's shot, and Michael is leaning over to him in his hospital bed, says like, "I'm with you, Papa. I'm with you now." And that's how I felt after the 2020 election. Like, I mean, I was enthusiastic about voting for him, but I was really with him, like after what they did, on November the 3rd, 2020. So,
yeah.
Curious, who do you think Trump's VP is going to be, since he's disclosed that he's already that he knows who it's going to be?
Yeah, I fear it's going to be Kristi Noem. I shouldn't say fear. She would be okay. I mean, she's like, I would tolerate her, I guess, is maybe the best way of putting it, but I wouldn't be enthusiastic about her.
I don't know if I don't know what the gain on that is for him.
The safe bet, I think, is one of the things on that one. Personally, I don't think so. I think he should go for a better insurance policy than her.
I would agree. Yeah, I don't think she's a good choice. Like, I personally like, Ron Johnson. I don't know if he's a strong enough insurance policy, but he is an insurance policy. Like, he pushed back on COVID narratives, and he's finally started to get it on Ukraine too. He was initially part of the group of senators that was voting for the funding that was going over there, and I think now he's kind of finally had enough. So I think he might be just enough of an insurance policy. I also do like the fact, because, like, look, God bless Trump for all he's done. I think most people would agree his judgment in picking personnel hasn't always been the best.
Right.
And I don't like the notion of him anointing his own successor to, and like, look, if I had confidence in him, I'd love to give him that honor. But I mean, I was kind of like, who are you going to foist on us here? And so, like, I don't know if I like the idea of him picking someone that is so obviously set up, like Noam would be, to be the future of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I tend to agree.
Yeah. I personally am still liking JD Vance as my favorite, but
I love JD Vance. Yeah.
Especially since he was a soldier. He's been he experienced all the BS that happened during the wars and knows how much of a scam a lot of this international stuff is. And yeah, he'd terrify he'd be very good insurance.
Yeah, like, I kind of map it out, and I think, like, okay, who would be a good insurance policy for Trump, a good successor, as the 2028 nominee, because then we need to get Carrie Lake into the Senate so then she can be on the ticket in 2028, and I think then you have a populist, leadership moving forward in the Republican Party.
I tend to agree. Dan, when you studied politics, did you tend to study more domestic or international?
It was probably more domestic at the time, like starting in college. Like, my international focus has been fairly recent, other than just the core principles of non-interventionism and America First, and understanding, like, how we have unnecessarily gotten ourselves into so many wars. I would say, like, I'm right now probably over the last few years, especially through the book club and some of the books we've read, of getting what I would say more granular in my knowledge of some of these different hotspots. Our friend Elon on the book club continues to amaze me with his depth of knowledge on every hotspot that you bring up and that you can ask him. But otherwise, it was mostly just general history. I love the history of elections. It's one of the things that connected me to Rich, that I was always interested in polling election results, and the dynamic of how coalitions would come together is always something that has really interested me. And basically, how do you govern a country? How do you put together 50% plus one,
right?
To govern the country? And that's an area now, like, say, in this post Roe versus Wade era, that I'm really trying to focus on, like, from the pro-life perspective. Like, okay, guys, And Trump is kind of talking to that too, maybe a little clumsier than some of us might like, but he's getting there, and his heart's in the right place, and he's pushing the right direction. We're saying like, okay, yeah, we want to be firm on our principle, but we also want to be part of a coalition that can govern and get some of this done. And that has always really fascinated me, and how you do that. And how do you divide somebody else's coalition? What's the wedge issue?
Ask them Israel or Palestine.
Yeah, that's right. That yeah. Right now it just jumped right up in front of us there.
Yeah,
so
divided
exactly.
everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I remember walking down to like the first week of the weekend after the war start, or this bout of violence started.
The October 7th, yeah.
Went down by my Hamilton City Hall, and there was like 500 Palestinians all protesting there. And I'm like, well, this is different.
So Dan, what are the issues that you're currently spending a lot of time reading, or capture your attention of this past year? What's captured your attention the most in the past year?
By far, Russia, Ukraine. I've consumed a lot of content about that. Now a little bit of the Middle East. General issues with the deep state. That wasn't something I had really thought about all that much. I mean, I was aware from the classic Reagan perspective of big government and the problems that were there, but really thinking about it in the way that we now talk about the deep state is definitely very new for me. So I've enjoyed listening to Bobby Kennedy talk about like big pharma and how they've maneuvered and worked. That's been really insightful. Robert Barnes has that series on his Locals platform, Hush Hush, and where I just consume that like let's examine an alternative way of looking at this narrative here. And ultimately it's about like being willing to challenge what you think because I feel like we're in such uncharted waters right now, of basically willing to step back and saying like, okay, look, I believed a lot of things. I'm sure a lot of them were true, but a lot of them probably weren't. There were probably myths that were mixed in there as well too, and being willing to challenge that. And I think the deep state, thrives on myths. In foreign policy, we talk about the myths of empire, but it's just, the myths, the narratives, the way they control the media. I just think all of it is just being willing to challenge what you think and so that's been just a very broad-based focus.
So having grown up during the Soviet Union, studied during that time, is there anything this past year's observing Russia, Ukraine, a realization that has hit you at this point in time in your life that made you rethink your perception of things back during the USSR, USA?
Funny you ask that. Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, I completely agree with Reagan when he characterized the Soviets as the evil empire and that there was a need for confrontation. What I question now is like I accepted the premise that not just under Reagan, but in the whole Cold War era, all the proxy wars that were fought, as in like, well, this was necessary because we were bleeding the Soviet Union and we were going to outlast them. And while there's something to be said for the part about we were going to outlast the Soviet Union, I really question whether or not the proxy wars did anything. And hey, look, I was in high school, and one of the first things we debated in 1986 was like the Nicaraguan Contras and aid there. And like I was like on fire for supporting the Contras. And look, generally speaking, I still would look at them sympathetically. But now I'm looking at it and saying like, well, was that really the U.S.'s problem? Did we, is that something that we had to be involved in?
Especially the human costs that came involved from it, from the way the CIA ended up funding it, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and like El Salvador would be another one you would throw into that mix there. That, who we had to ally ourselves with sometimes. Some of these, obvious dictatorships on, that they call them right wing, but I think we know they're basically fascist dictatorships that just simply because they're anti-communist. I was like, did that really matter? And like, look, if it did, then there's a case to be made for it, but I really question it. And the reason is because all of the proxy wars never changed the Soviet Union's behavior. It's like they were in their wheelhouse. They were comfortable with that. But when Ronald Reagan came out and said, like, I've got this idea for a space-based missile defense, that rattled the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I look back at it and say, like, and now I look at this from a Catholic perspective and the doctrines of just war, of when war is justified and when it isn't. And like these proxy wars are pretty iffy at best, I think, on just war theory. But Ronald Reagan's belief in space-based missile defense, like if you read his diaries, it had such a moral underpinning to it. He said, like, this is insane, immoral madness that we think the only way we can defend ourselves is to threaten to obliterate the other country off the earth with our own nuclear weapons. He's like, there has got to be a better, more ethical way. And when he did that, it just shook up the whole system. And we know in Reykjavik in 1986, when like he and Gorbachev were on the verge of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev said, well, this is all contingent on you giving up strategic defense. And Reagan said, no way, we will never give that up. In fact, we will share it with the world because it is necessary to protect ourselves. And so Reagan was, he let the deal die then, but it rattled the Soviets enough to know that they could not keep up with the U.S. in a race that went to space. And so I think looking at it from that perspective of like that Reagan truly understood peace through strength, that like he definitely was the advocate of the strong defense, and this is where conservatism has changed. Like the neocons do not understand the peace aspect of it. Like they really think the strength is just so we can constantly be fighting somewhere. So
the forever war concept. I remember back during the early days of COVID, there was a YouTube group of war gamers, professional level war gamers, and they're talking about this. And in one of the videos, there was a guy who was talking about the SDI initiative. And what they determined was that they could never get 100% defenses to cover the entire United States. But they started saying, what happens when we war game this out at different levels? What will happen? And they got up to 50%. And they realized at that point, that's when the Soviet Union ran out of missiles.
Wow.
And you're talking about SDI, so I thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, that's right. Holy cow.
They're like 50% coverage. We can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And that might be all it takes to deter an attack too, So.
Yeah.
That's the other thing Trump is so good at, is just like, at just keeping the world on their back foot. I mean, I'm not going to say it didn't make me nervous a few times, like when he was going back on Twitter with Kim Jong, back in 2017 or 18 or whatever it was. And I'd be like, oh man, I hope you know what you're doing. But I come to realize, like, Trump, I think just as a businessman, real estate developer, he's very comfortable living in the ambiguity of negotiation. Right. And like, I'm terrible at it. Like, I can't scalp a ticket to a baseball game without just saying, like, look, just give me the first deal you have. And if I'm happy, I'll take it. Whereas like, Trump is one who's just comfortable letting things unfold in that very ambiguous state and letting other people be in that ambiguous state too, where like you've heard him say, like, he would maybe make some threats to Putin about what would happen if he would invade Ukraine. And Putin would say, like, oh, you're not going to do that. And Trump would say, try me. And then Trump added, he said, like, look, I don't know if he believed me, but he believed me just enough. And that's all it took. So,
that's something else. Dave, did you have another set of questions?
Well, what is it? We wanted to talk about some of the other stuff we've been talking about. Oh, I did notice that I did figure out one Midwestern politician who seemed to have a bit, I don't know if you would consider Kansas Midwest.
Oh, yeah,
Bob Dole was definitely presidential candidate and a candidate once. And he was talking about the 1976 debate where he makes that line about all the if we added up all the Democrat dead that was killed in all the wars they caused this century, we could fill Detroit. And then Detroit was 3 million people at the time. And thinking also, he was one of the few people who showed up to the 2016 Republican convention.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of odd at the time. I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. But he, as we were talking earlier about Midwestern populism, here's a guy who's an actual Midwestern populist.
And now that as we're talking about this, I can't believe I'm forgetting this name because Jim Trafficant, the Congressman from Ohio. He was a hardcore protectionist.
Mhm.
And like I still remember, like I was in college watching the debate on NAFTA, a sign that my social life in college was maybe less than stellar, that I was watching this debate on NAFTA on C-SPAN. But but it was Jim Trafficant who was going off about, like, if we send, basically the argument against it, like they're just gonna exploit labor down there, ship the products back in, undercut us. And I'm listening to him. And at the time, all I knew was like, okay, well, I'm a Republican and conservative, and they generally support free trade. So I was on the side of NAFTA.
Mhm.
But I was listening to it, I was like, he's right. This makes sense. And the Republicans that would counter didn't have anything more than, well, we have to believe in a free market. I was kind of like, well, no, not, you don't have to take it to an extreme if it's not what's best for the country. Now, of course, Trafficant had many other issues, like in terms of how he went about things off the field, shall we say?
Yeah.
But he definitely understood the populist connection on those working class economic issues.
Yeah. No, I've experienced that myself. Was I'm I follow a guy named Jerry Purnell, who's a science fiction writer who's affiliated with the Reagan administration as well a bit. Apparently, the rumor got around at NASA that he was going to be made the NASA administrator, and people were starting to throw themselves off the roof, apparently. But he's also he's the one that people pointed out to me all the problems with free trade and stuff like that. And it's just like, look, economics should not be a suicide pact. Well, just because it works in the theory doesn't necessarily mean it makes the most sense in the way things work. You mentioned earlier that you'd like to speak a bit more of the problems with intervention. What do you think is? We had just had breaking news tonight about what's going on in the Yemeni Strait. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, obviously a tragedy, again, and I'm really worried, about the prospect of another, foreign war, another escapade. It just seems like, the military industrial complex always finds something, and because there's always something going, wrong in the world somewhere. I just look back on, our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I remember, I was texting with a friend, a more traditional, Republican, my age and everything, and and this was maybe a year or two ago, and talking about Iraq or something, and he said, like, why don't you let that go? It was 20 years ago, and nobody who did it is still around anymore. And I was kind of thinking, like, well, first off, it just ended in August 2021. Like, now is actually the time we should start looking at it, because now we have it in the history books and we can start to unpack it and know what worked, what didn't. And as far as like the people around, I'm kind of like, I'm not missing something. Dick Cheney's daughter is like Trump's foremost critic in the Republican Party. So, carrying on daddy's mission. So it's like, I didn't quite get the logic there behind that at all. And, but, as you look back on that and look at, it was first and foremost, it was a humanitarian tragedy. It was over in the Middle East, all of the people that, all the guys over here, the guys and women that went and fought, people that came back with PTSD, everything else. And when you look at those wars in conjunction with the free trade agenda and the hollowing out of the Rust Belt, it's like you can see a portrait of, I would call, a slow moving American tragedy. It's like you've got economic opportunity disappearing. So you get all these kids that will volunteer to go into the military as a way to, get their education and everything else. And look, I have no doubt that there's very sincere patriotism involved too. But I mean, it's also something that, like, the numbers do show us that you're far more likely to join if there's economic necessity involved in there as well. So now you've got them all in the military. Now you're going to launch this 20-year war where you're basically sending them all into a meat grinder. They're going to come back, PTSD. You're going to jack them full of opioids. We had, tie the opioid scandal that was into that mix, the painkillers. And so now you've got this downward spiral. They've, how many marriages did not survive those multiple tours of duty, those long 18-month tours that they were doing over and over and over again. So now you got broken families, and which tends to lead to economic hardship. And so now you have another generation of kids that's ready to start the same cycle all over again. And it's kind of like, this is madness. And because it happens over a 20 to 30 year period, you really can't always see it in the moment. It's only after you look back, like we can in the 21st century and what's happened since 9/11, that you can really say this is what's happened in America, and both parties were complicit. And and when I hear people say like they can't understand why Trump's people are so loyal to him, it's kind of like, well, maybe if you just stopped and thought about this for a second, if you thought outside your own worldview for 1 second, you might at least understand. Maybe you still wouldn't agree, but you might at least get it, and you'd stop with the whole Cult 45 and all these other little slurs that they throw out there. And that's again like the impact on the country, but the country abroad, but also the impact on our domestic politics, because the Republican Party has not been the same since that war. Rich has talked about this, that George W. Bush was starting to tap into the Hispanic vote in the early 21st century. He was making some inroads. But I mean, it turns out when you send people's kids overseas, tank the housing market, and basically wreck their lives, suddenly they don't like you so much anymore. Right. So it's so that's so we're still kind of rebuilding from that.
So Dan, to bring it back to you, we've been talking quite a bit. But one thing that I was curious about you is you're a writer. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the literature you've made?
Yeah, I've written, and like I mentioned earlier, an Irish Catholic novel. It's set in South Boston in the 1940s. Anyone wants to go on Amazon, it's called Fulcrum, Fulcrum. I chose that title because I wanted the Irish Catholic world, while it was right as its fulcrum, its pivot point, where the immigrant class was about ready to come into prosperity, but at what cost was kind of the question, the way I was phrasing it, And then also, I mean, my passion is sports nostalgia. I have a website, thesportsnotebook.com, which has literally a couple thousand articles based on American sports history. I've written 3 books that cover different aspects of American sports on the 1978 baseball season, Notre Dame football, the 1980s, and God willing, we'll be able to do a few more, before my life is over. So it's what I really love to do most of all. So that's the writing that really drives me. And then I kind of play around with fiction from a standpoint of politics. Like I've always thought, like if you could take a good political story and put it into fiction, into a narrative like that, it's like it could be much more powerful than just simply, clinically making the argument. Like when you can let other people, like your characters, make the argument. And I do my Substack, which is cornedbeefcatholicism.substack.com. It's mostly politics. And as the title indicates, we blend some faith commentary, some theological commentary in there as well, too.
So I'm curious about this because I'm also Catholic as well. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be Catholic and political? What does it mean to? Let's just start with that. What do you think it means to be like American and Catholic? Where do you think the overlap between being American and Catholic? How's that? How would you define that personally?
Yeah, wow, that's.
You take a lot of pride in this, and I'm curious where you feel the overlap between being Catholic and being American is.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would start with to say, like, I mean, if we really started to pick nits, I would identify myself as a Catholic American first. Like, I believe first in the Catholic Church, and then I believe in the constitutional republic. Now, thankfully, I believe our constitutional republic is firmly rooted in the Catholic principles of subsidiarity, that decision-making should always be devolved out to the lowest possible source, that you try to divide powers, that even though our founders were not Catholic, obviously, they certainly, for whatever reason, there was a lot of alignment in the approach they took to designing our system of government, and what I think is properly rooted in Catholic thinking. And I've got a good friend who's studied Thomas Aquinas extensively, and kind of he backs up with a doctrine what I kind of know instinctively, which is that that this all works together. So yeah, I guess I would, I don't know if it's necessarily an overlap, but I think that's probably how I would.
I'll evolve the question. As a Catholic, now that Roe v. Wade's overturned, what do you think the top 3 political issues should be for a Catholic now that Roe v. Wade's overturned?
Yeah, now at the state level, I still do think it is the right to life. I actually think there should be some friends of ours like had a great idea. They said the March for Life in DC has to go. It's gone. And what there should be happening is there should be marches at every state capital on the anniversary of the Dobbs decision in June. We've got to get that out of the federal, sphere. Right. At least for now. I mean, look, in the big picture on a moral level, I don't think states' rights is the answer any more than slavery. But I also know that slavery didn't get abolished like overnight, that the abolitionists had to really bide their time before there was a national consensus. And we are a heck of a long way from that moment. So right now, let's just keep it at the states. I think at the presidential level where we've been talking about, I think dealing with human trafficking is the thing that I would say is most comparable to what abortion was when in the Roe era, in that you have innocent victims, you have the ability of a president, I think, to act very unilaterally in taking action to protect those victims. That, the president could act overnight to start securing that border, that the cartels are using to transport these kids, in and out of the country. So I think that absolutely has to be the top priority at the federal level. And then foreign wars, to return to our theme here, that these wars from a Catholic perspective, I think they fail every standard of just war. I think they're mostly, look, I'll allow the fact that, you don't really know for sure with these things until it's over and you can look at it from the perspective of history. But I see them mostly as being rooted in immoral foundations, because one of the principles of a just war is that it's not going to create more problems than it solves. And I've yet to see one of these conflicts that met even that minimal criteria. Mm-hmm. So I would kind of look at it from that perspective of control human trafficking and stop the foreign wars, and then get the right to life focused at the state level.
Mm. Okay. That's real interesting on the, it's an interesting take on the evolving just Catholic vote, because it is a hot debate everywhere you go on what's, because other minds would say it's like still poverty, still helping the poor, and I think human trafficking, I think, is where a lot of overlap is coming in quite a bit.
Yeah,
and then a return to faith, the trad Catholic thing has come up quite a bit in my age group, and it's interesting to see sort of a bit of a revival come in, because there is a lot of religious fervor with a younger generation.
Yeah.
But that's coming after my generation, which has a lot of religious apathy.
Yep.
And it's interesting to see how the folks are really trying to rediscover what it means to be Catholic, or define it in this day and age.
Yeah, I would actually say, I was giving the priorities from a political perspective, but clearly just the basic return to faith, and just, learn your faith, go to mass, go to confession, say the rosary, like that's always where, as a Catholic, that's always where I'm going to say the answer is going to be, like anything, it's got to start there. But, like from a, so I give the answer from a political perspective as to, where we have to focus. And I suppose I should have brought up this whole, the trans nonsense that goes on, but like, yes. I don't have time to follow that because I think it's so insane and so crazy. Like, I prefer to take on issues where I feel like there's some kind of nuance, where there's like a legitimate counterpoint that can be made to my argument. And I'm kind of like, no, you're a boy or a girl. There is not a legitimate counterpoint to this argument.
It does get boring, and then before you know it, you're just arguing with insanity. It's just like, all right, pretty much. Do you want me to say no in different languages?
I know. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree. I'm curious to your thoughts on what needs to happen for faith to find its way back into the political discourse, or maybe community discourse. How do Catholics or even Christians find their footing in modern America? What do you feel is maybe degraded that needs to come back in the family unit, specifically in the day-to-day practices, to find that, let's say, Christian spirit or identity that America, that probably you grew up with, that seems to have degraded over time? One thing that I've always felt is that over the generations, there's been a general disingenuousness that goes on from passing it from generation to generation. And I think that's sort of what's watered it down. But I'm kind of curious to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for me, that answer is always very simple. The rosary is what, brings it back. That, my Irish Catholic grandmother always like walked to mass every day with her rosary beads wrapped around her knuckles. And, of course was, when she was buried, they were wrapped, in the casket. And, by the time I was, growing up in the Catholic schools, the rosary had kind of fallen out of use. And it was in my late 20s that like I kind of rediscovered it, or from my perspective, just discovered it. And it really just had a transforming effect for me. I can't like name one thing in particular, but it's like suddenly like I began to view the world from more of a faith-based perspective at that point. And that, like I'd always viewed the world up to then from a conservative perspective. I identified as a Reagan conservative. And like I said, for the most part, like probably 75, 80% of the stuff I thought I still think, but there was a whole mental paradigm that began to change. Like I was kind of like, okay, that is secondary, like that's part of this world. Whereas, the faith, the doctrines, the sacraments, like that's what we believe is eternal. That's what we can hold on to in these very insane, crazy times, that we're living. Whereas everything political, I mean, even something as important as the right to life movement, I mean, that's still a political movement. It's got to be sanctified from above if it's really going to last, have any kind of real lasting impact. So so for me, like for me, it always starts with the rosary, and then it leads there and to Christ, from there into the sacraments. But the rosary has always been a great starting point for me.
Good words to have on the topic. A follow up to that is, how do we recapture that identity, but also find it in other people that do not have our background and maybe can break bread with them? I think Vivek Ramaswamy with this. How do you feel Christians and Catholics specifically accept a person like Vivek, who at his core doesn't, he doesn't carry the same Christian faith that we do, but he says a lot of the right things. And there's this aura of distrust that comes around Vivek, and I have it too. And I'm curious if, for you, or maybe people if that's just because it's just at his core he's too different. And could a guy like Vivek be accepted, or is it going to take something more, or is it never going to happen? Because more people like him are probably going to be coming up the pipeline, and the question is there a willingness to have them at the table, especially when they have really solid rhetoric?
Yeah. Now, for me personally, it's really not a problem. Offhand, I personally don't know anybody. I mean, again, I'm not going to speak for everybody. No, but I don't know anyone that I would think of and say like, oh, they're going to have a problem with that. I think in this regard, what President Trump did for the pro-life movement, I think was very significant, in that this was somebody who was not one of us. And in fact, if we go back 20 years, was actively working against us, but yet will have his place in history as the movement's biggest political hero. So I think, it was kind of really, I kind of look at it, it was like, it was the gospel come to life, where when Christ came, he acted in very unexpected ways. And we all got to see that and, and learn from that. And as a result, I think that other people who might not be, one of us, quote unquote, might have an easier time, getting acceptance if they prove trustworthy. Because like, I have my doubts about Vivek. It's not necessarily because he's not one of me. I'm just kind of like, has he just memorized a few lines that he knows we want to hear? Like, that's
is he like what we thought Trump was in 2016?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. It's exactly it.
I have no record. We don't know how he would actually govern. This is not the problem. Though what you were just talking about does kind of remind me of some things about the civil rights movement, where two of the biggest champions of it are unrepentant racists. LBJ passed the civil rights movement, and Truman desegregated the army. I mean,
yeah, that's right.
And these guys were Southern racists.
That's right. Yeah. In terms of like, how do we like kind of rekindle things in the in the country and society as a whole? I guess for me, like one of my favorite books in the Bible at the very end is the Epistle of the Catholic Epistle of Saint James, and I think it's at the start of chapter 2, where the gist of it is like before you preach to someone, feed them first. Like don't preach to someone who's on an empty stomach. And
Right.
now the empty stomach problem in America, like even with some of our economic problems, we're still, pretty well off, but there's still real human needs that like, no, the human needs aren't the end game, but like the church has lost a lot of its goodwill, and justifiably so, with the scandals that have happened and everything. It's a tragedy, but like when you hear people say stuff, I'm kind of like, yeah, well, I mean, if I didn't believe it, I'd probably say the same thing, so it's it is what it is. And so I just think some demonstration, of goodwill. It's one of the reasons I put like a lot of the effort I do into sports writing and things like that. I'm kind of like, hey, this is something I can give the world as a whole, that like it doesn't matter what you believe or what you think. If you like baseball or football or whatever, you just might enjoy this, and maybe you can just relax and take a deep breath and get away from the hustle and bustle and enjoy something. And from a political perspective, focusing on the question of like the issues we've been talking about, like of stopping the foreign wars, strengthening people's currency. You just make their lives a little bit better. And and I mean, and you guys follow Rich's show, like he's been talking about how the faithful like are antagonized from the church, and it's not just in the Catholic Church, in all of them, because they kind of, and they're antagonized from a lot of the politicians that come off as the faith leaders, because they're kind of like, you lied us into a war. Like, now you're going to sit around like Mike Pence. I mean, and to see Mike Pence still welcomed by like, some of these Catholic pro-life organizations, I just look at it and think like, I can't blame someone who looks at it and says
they repute the faithful to show that they're moderate.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right. So like I think like it can just kind of start with just these, find some of these common touch points that are there where we, can intersect together, whether it's Catholics, whether Christians, whether it's, Christians with, the Jewish people, or Vivek, I think, is Hindu, or just someone who's just struggling with belief, period. Like there's always going to be some window where we can connect and say like, okay, we have this point of common ground. We can build off it and see where it goes. And if it goes somewhere, great. And if it doesn't go somewhere, well, maybe we'll at least alleviate a civil war in the process. So,
well, if that point of common ground, I think for a lot of folks, it tends to be one of two things. It's either music or sports. How do you feel in your experience? What are some of the best examples that are not as popularized of sports being that common ground for people?
I mean, for everybody, it would be a little bit different. I mean, like, up here in the Boston area, certainly like the Red Sox and the Patriots over the years have served that role, that like I could just like you can just obviously a lot of Democrats surround me here, but like you can just casually talk about the Patriots, or Bill Belichick stepped down today. Like that could be an easy point of conversation with anybody. And
legends retired this week.
I know, yeah. Belichick, Saban, and Carroll all going.
Just you know what? This is week 2 of January. We're done.
It's funny. I thought like, wow, all the pundits we've been following have saying 2024 is going to be a tumultuous year. I said like, I hope this is it, and it stops right now. But I have a feeling it might be a little rockier than that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely wild.
But just having little things to kibitz with people over is just so important. Just little, it doesn't have to be like anything super profound, but just like I'm on a text thread with people in Wisconsin, and they're all excited about the Packers right now, and they're chit-chatting back and forth, and and really don't care who's going to vote for who on Monday in Iowa or anything. So it's and that's to as long as it's not used to like bury yourself from the world, that's healthy and necessary.
I'm curious, in your decades of watching sports and, being a part of the scene, do you think fans prefer the story of a athlete who with high expectations that lives up to them, or the sleeper that defies expectation?
Oh, the sleeper by far. Everybody identifies with the underdog.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, there may be a handful of commentators like Skip Bayless would be one who just gravitate to the number one pick who lives up to it, but otherwise, like, everybody can gravitate towards the underdog because everybody can identify with
Especially
that to a
Americans.
certain degree.
And
It's not always fair because a lot of times the guy, like, who is like the highly touted person had his own adversity to overcome, and you just weren't as aware of it until he got on the public stage, but
Yeah.
but it is what it is.
I sort of saw that with U of H this past week with basketball. They were the only undefeated team in the nation at the time, and the announcers were so one sided. My whole family was like, "What the hell's up with these announcers?" And I'm like, "Guys, we're the only undefeated team in the country. We're the bad guys."
That's right. Yeah.
Every team we play going forward until we get beaten, we're the bad guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
So who is your favorite underdog in sports through the decades that's come up? Like who's your favorites? Who has been your favorite story, or maybe you have like a top three?
Yeah, actually, it's just because, like, when I look back on teams that I really enjoyed, like, I mean, I've seen my teams win championships, but a couple of ones that really stand out, like, are ones that didn't. And when I was going to school in Indiana in 1993, Calbert Cheney was their forward there at the time, was one of my all-time favorite players, and they had this team, like, it wasn't really big. They didn't have a true center. They weren't very deep. I think they only went around 6 deep. But they were so good, and they beat Michigan's Fab Five twice, 3 times in 4 years. And they were rolling into the NCAA tournament number 1, and then one of their key players blew out his knee in February, and they still got halfway through the NCAA tournament even without him. But like eventually that loss was too much to overcome, and they finally came up short. But I always just look at like that was. I mean, and in the state of Indiana, if you mention 1993, everyone's like, yeah, if Alan Henderson doesn't blow out his knee, we're champs that year. And the Red Sox team that I remember really fondly is 2005. And now 2004 was the year they won their historic championship, first time in 86 years. And then in that off season, they had one of our best pitchers, Pedro Martinez, left for free agency. Kurt Schilling, one of the other stars, was basically hurt because he had blown out his ankle pitching us to the championship the previous October. The Yankees had gone out and signed Randy Johnson, one of the best pitchers in baseball. And there was, and our best reliever, Keith Falk, ended up hurt the whole year. So I'd be like, that should have been a completely seismic shift in the rivalry. But yet we played the Yankees to a tie, and both teams made the playoffs at the end of the year. And I'm kind of like, that's real overachievement right there. And I still look back on those 05 Red Sox really fondly.
That's cool. Yeah, I don't have that same passion that you, but it's always captivating, hearing the stories and just like the way the passion you speak of it. It's like I could just see it, myself, and it's cool that you recite the memories of it with such, because I mean when you're living it, I mean I share that sentiment with like the U of H team under Tom Herman, the football team. It was an absolutely exciting time. That was like my senior year, and we rushed the field 4 or 5 times, and the way the man played the game was just so different. He would go on 4th and 5, and everybody like, "What are you doing?" And he would just confidently pick it up, and it was so uncommon for us to be so confidently aggressive and win the way we win, because we have the joke with the U of H team is we're the cardiac Cougs, where we win every game in the last second, no matter how bad we're getting beaten. Where it comes down to it's a half joke, because really it's really frustrating, because there are teams we should be absolutely killing, but we hold them to the end of the game and then we win, and we're just like, that was so unnecessary. And then we have teams like UT where we almost took them into overtime to win, and completely out of nowhere. And that's and then the West Virginia game this year, we won on a Hail Mary pass, and it was still
That's
a funny
right,
thing because it was 99% West Virginia in the last 5 seconds, and then U of H won the game. And those moments are just so exciting, especially when you have the Tom Herman team, which really was an underrated team, just coming out, and they didn't just beat like good teams for the time. These were like they beat the Oklahoma season opener of 2018 when we picked up Ed Oliver. That was arguably Oklahoma's best team ever. Baker Mayfield, all like players that are still very relevant today were on that team. And it was just an incredible time to, be a part of that and watch the team, defy expectation and really just dominate. That was something that it's when a team didn't, it's not like a slow, burn. It's just like dominance. Not like, are they going to lose ever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's fun when you win, a lot of those times. And then obviously you have the Astros with like the story of Jose Altuve, which is just absolutely incredible. His journey coming up and the faith that they had in that guy. And then for him to freaking clutch moments like the first World Series run where freaking dude sunk 2 grand slams to keep us in the game, and the score was like 18-18, something insane.
That game 5 against the Dodgers.
Absolutely insane. It was
even like last October, that home run he hit against the Rangers, like at the end. And of course, like, the Rangers did end up winning the series, but when he hit that to win that game and it looked like that was going to make the difference, I was like, this guy is unbelievable. Like, I mean, it's like Jeter level here,
he's consistent under pressure. I mean, it's just when bases are loaded, 2 strikes, 3 balls, and you need this to happen, man comes through.
Nice.
Of course, he's got that tomahawk swing too. Everything looks so violent every time he swings the bat too.
Yeah. So, what is your? I mean, well, shoot. While we're on the topic, what's your prediction for next MLB season?
Oh, I don't have one yet. I got to wait and see how everything sorts out with free agency. Here in Boston, we're just wondering if we're ever gonna like contend again, or if ownership is content to just let us slip into mediocrity for a while now. So
it's the Patriots' future is in question now. How do you replace Bill Belichick?
I hope they hire Mike Vrabel. That's what I'm really pulling for right now. So.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question overall. How do you replace Belichick? How do you replace Saban? Who replaces Saban?
Who wants that job right now?
Yeah, seriously, because if you're at any other school, it's just like, no, that was our biggest competition. I'm sticking here.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
So,
David, promote someone up through the ranks.
Yeah, David, tell us something about hockey.
Yeah, well,
love hockey here too. Yeah,
I'm not. I only usually pay attention to sports when people at my work are interested in sports, so I can have conversations with them. So when they're at my current job, no one gives a damn about sports. So I don't really pay as much attention to that. For me, sporting is actually elections. That's what I will pay a lot of attention to, like Rich Barris does with that kind of thing. That's why I'm so much interested in that kind of stuff. Like just like watching how it all works out, and that's my sport. It's like watching for me the American presidential election night is the Super Bowl.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. That's so what are your thoughts then, David, like looking ahead to the 2024 elections? I mean, is Trump going to make what's going to happen in the House and the Senate too? What do you think?
Yeah, so I know a lot of people are thinking it will be Trump will win and then down ballot those groups will lose. But I find it hard to believe if you're going in and you're putting in your vote for Trump, you will not vote down ballot along the line just because you're doing that, right? So I do think that you'll see a lot of pick me up that despite the fact that people think the Republicans in the Senate and the House will suck, if they're going out to vote for Trump, they're going to vote down ballot for him as well. And often you see unless he screws up the election and he's going to lose, you won't see a lot of points going to people like Bobby Kennedy or any of the other left-wing things, because this is what happens every time in the Canadian election, where we have 3 political parties, maybe 4. So if you are very close or you're blowing it out, you're going to vote for the guy. But if he's screwing it up, then you start thinking about, well, now I'm going to punish this guy for screwing things up, and I'll go vote for the third party. So as many of these people go like, what's his name? Eric Hunley's partner, Mark Rubert, are very worried about Kennedy stealing votes from Trump. I just don't see it happening unless Trump's going to lose. And it'll be very obvious he's losing when they make that decision.
When the decision.
And the other thing I've noticed, most people make up their decisions if they're going to vote in person in the last 2 weeks. You have this huge perpetual election machine that's always going on. And it's not really like, a lot of people are not paying attention to that. And they'll come down the last 2 weeks and say, well, the economy is crappy. I'm going to vote for the guy who gave me a job, who I could pay my rent on. I was in $1,000 of credit card debt. The guy cut my taxes. I'm going to vote for the guy who gave me all that stuff. So,
yeah,
we'll end up seeing. I mean, it's still quite a little bit of time for our first primary, and yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of irrelevant at this point in time. It's we're pretty much on rails for what's going to end up happening coming for the primary. Trump's got this in the bag, and none of the other candidates are going to do a squat about it. I'm not worried about RFK. I don't even think he's going to make it on the ballot, if I'm being totally honest.
He's made it on the ballot in quite a few states, but
yes,
but not all.
I think Utah officially.
Yeah.
That's I mean, if he got on the ballot in all the states, do you guys think he would get to 10% of the national vote, or would he be in single digits somewhere?
Yeah, he'll be in single digits.
Yeah, single digits. I don't. I don't know how he secures the funds to even run a campaign. It's just. I mean, one that's serious about winning. I mean, you could vote for the guy, but the fact of the matter is, he does not have a competent machine to actually contend for the presidency, and it really comes down to he doesn't have the support. Yeah. There really isn't an infrastructure backing the man, because he wants to. I respect the hustle, buck the system, but you need to go through that primary system and contend, even if it's unfair. That's something that you had to give credit Bernie for. Bernie kept trying, and he inched up until they had to shut it down on him. And it's I don't know. The Democratic primary system is very shady, in my opinion.
What, 55 coin toss flips in a row? I mean,
besides Trump, who else? Is there any particular candidates nationally, like in the other races, that really kind of attract your attention, that you're really hoping win or hoping lose, or anything like that?
Man, I mean, I'd love to see Kerry Lake win Senate in Arizona.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I mean, I'm pretty. It really doesn't. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's Trump or bust. I mean, it's
New York. New York is very interesting to me. The fact that with Trump on the top of the ballot, it's within striking distance.
That is,
especially if the other person I've heard, I don't know anything about him, but people have mentioned Lee Zeldin as a possible VP candidate. That's right.
Yeah.
And that to me would be more consequential.
Yeah.
That would be more consequential, I think, for Trump's ticket potentially.
Yeah.
That actually, I forgot about that name. That does make a lot of sense. And I'm hoping David Giglio gets into Congress out in California, in McCarthy's old district.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Volunteered to help phone bank for him, and then here in Massachusetts, we're totally focused on like getting these. Well, I mean, nationally they call him the precinct chairman. If you guys watch Steve Bannon, he's always pushing the precinct strategy. But in Massachusetts, they just call him the state committee man and state committee woman. And they'll be on the ballot in March. And I'm kind of networked with some people that are like very pro-Trump and are running for those seats.
Right.
Because look, Massachusetts is one of those states, and Rich said something on his show, and this was a couple of years ago, and it always stuck with me. He said, Democrats never write off a state. He said they will look at a state and say, like, hey, maybe this will never be a great area for us, but if we put the work in, we could build up, and we can grab this district, and we can grab that district, and, and you never know. Like, demographics change, dynamics change, and that's kind of how I feel about Massachusetts, that, like, we're losing in the state house, our margins, we're behind 134 to 25 right now. Like, I'm sorry, that's insane. Like, in the state Senate, the margin is 37 to 3. Like, there's no reason we can't have 40 to 45% of the seats. And, like, you at least people have to deal with you then, so.
I remember watching after the Virginia elections this year, and I went on Ricochet itself, and I was really annoyed because I'm like, you didn't run. You ran unopposed in like 30% of the seats the Democrats won. And they did this a few, but this is clearly corruption. This is not like, it's like, and you're telling me it's only going to cost you 15, 20 grand a run? Like, come on, guys. Like, this is like, we've had people come forward. I've interviewed on the previous version of this podcast, and they're just like, the local Republicans or the local Democrats have made power sharing deals, and they've agreed to give us your crumbs, and we won't oppose you. And that's why I think a lot of the mess that's going on.
No, that's exactly it. I've gotten to meet the former chair of the RNC here, and he said, like, the number of vendors that have business relationships, like, based on just their connections, is just like you wouldn't believe it. And so he's someone we're working with to try to, and he's someone who's serious about reforming it. He was serious enough that they booted him out in the last vote for the chair. So we realized we got to get more people in the state precinct levels,
right?
So, like, people at the highest levels have some protection. So
Interesting. Well, David, did you want to have any final questions on the?
You know what? Why don't we go kind of like our usual kind of standard one? We stole it from another much bigger podcast. But what do you think we should be talking about that we're not talking about?
Ooh. What should we be talking about that we're not talking about?
Don't get tunnel vision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. What's the thing that's sitting out there? And of course, by definition, that's probably not something you're aware of. Actually, I'm going to throw this out there, that this has struck me that I think in conservative, populist, whatever you want to call it, circles, I think everything pertaining to COVID has been allowed to be swept under the rug a little too easily. I think in the course of the Trump DeSantis fights, that there became a mindset that started to say, like, well, look, DeSantis, go away because nobody cares about COVID anymore. And I've always thought that was the wrong tack to take. I got it why they did it for short-term political expediency. But first off, I mean, there are, compelling arguments to be made on behalf of Trump. I'm kind of like, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can, and a lot of people did make them on Trump's behalf. But I was like, we should never forget what the lockdowns were. I mean, that was basically stealing $3 trillion from small businesses and transferring it to Amazon and Walgreens and those places that were allowed to stay open. It was one of the greatest thefts in the history of the world. And it should never, be forgotten, just because, just because there's a political primary fight, going on, in the moment. I think that, again, I don't, Trump doesn't have anything to apologize for. And Trump influencers don't have anything to apologize for. Keep hammering that point. And let's continue to bring out all of the human cost that's going to come. Like we were talking earlier in the show about the wars and how the cost didn't become obvious until years after the fact. What's going to be the cost of those lockdowns and those kids being held back from school? Again, marriages that couldn't survive, being together all the time, and whatever it is, that's going to be heavy, and we should not lose sight of that.
Right. Or the normalcy of just being able to send kids home like they're doing in New York to house the migrants. Like, people are like, oh my gosh, this is so terrible. And I'm looking at that, and it's a bad school that they're cleaning out. And I guarantee you that in a year's time, when they go back and they're looking at the performance, they're going to say, well, the reason why they're doing so bad is because we moved all these migrants in here. That's why we're underperforming. It gives them a reason to suck.
That's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I feel like these things are going to be used as a, well, darn it, if we hadn't sent those kids home to do that universal learning, we wouldn't be doing so bad. We should get more funding to try something new.
Yeah.
But thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. This has been good. You have been a very interesting person.
No, thank you. I'm glad I met that expectation. Thanks. No, I always enjoy talking to you guys each Sunday, so it was fun to be on here.
Yeah. For everyone, this is also a good time. Richard Bear's People's Hub Pundit holds an excellent book club. We're currently reading The Emergent Republican Majority, and it's a fantastic book. Everyone on this stream is a part of it. If you want a very educated, lively group to participate with, join Richard Bear's The People's Pundits on Locals and come join us on the book club and enjoy really a lot of good literature and good discussion.
Yeah, it's great.
Bye-bye to the audience.
Take care.